Notacon.
I guess let's get it going, I guess. Is that good with everybody? To get started? And any objections at all? Great. Well, hey, Melinda, I have something for you. Come on up here. Collect your prize.
Ooh.
There you go.
Oh, sorry. I know what this is.
It's jewelry.
I love a man who gives me jewelry. It's lovely.
I'm trying to. This isn't so secret, is it?
I've got two of them.
Oh. And I've got two of them as well. So actually, Melinda's going to be the maid of honor at our wedding this summer, and so that's actually some jewelry from my wife-to-be for her. So that's what that's all about. I actually did have presents for the rest of you, believe it or not, and I was just talking to Brandon about this. I have in my car a large stack of books that I've reviewed and received for free and stuff like that that simply don't fit on my shelves, and so I brought them, and the goal was to give them away if you asked a good question. You could come up, get your pick of books and stuff like that.
Why did you read the book?
This question does not get you a book, but it does get you an answer. Even better than a book. Basically, they're like a block away, but the garage is all locked up, and it wasn't worth the felony to break in to get them. But I think the garage might actually open up by the end of my talk, so I'll like run over there, bring them back, and then just find me, and you can take books out of my big orange bag. Only one book's spoken for, it's Alan's. Other than that, it's things like the Secure Shell book, the Kerberos book, things I've reviewed in Slashdot or elsewhere. So pretty good books, it's just that they no longer fit on my shelf and I no longer have a need for them. The other interesting thing about this talk is, aside from finishing the slides at about 1:30 in the morning, I was just telling Chris about this. Basically, I developed the slides months ago, hoping to present this actually at PyCon in DC, because actually all the code's written in Python. They passed on it for whatever brain dead reason, but basically, well, no, that's good, because I actually love coming here to Notacon and kind of giving like the first round of a presentation, because it's a good audience, it's among friends, it's for friends, and the talk I gave last year, which I was actually only kind of awake for about half of it, I wound up basically flying halfway around the world to give, and I'm flying around the world giving it a few more times. So things that kind of start here for me wind up being pretty good. So I'm more than happy to kind of try out a brand new talk on you guys, as well as some new techniques basically on my slides. So I've been reading this really cool PowerPoint site called beyondbullets.com. It's kind of a new idea of getting rid of bullet points actually in your PowerPoint talks. So I basically tried to do that as much as possible in this. So I went from this very bullet point heavy presentation to this very picture-centric presentation. Last night I kind of brought back in a few bullet points. So that's kind of why the slides might be a little bit disorganized, why I might be a little bit disorganized up here and disoriented up here as well. Without any more explanation of what I'm talking about, I guess I'd start talking about it. RSS clustering is the topic and the title, obviously. I'm here basically doing things that I do outside of work. What's interesting is that the topic itself, to me, kind of comes out of my need of basically digesting lots and lots and lots of information in kind of a continuous stream. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But it originally came out of my interest basically in trying to correlate IDS events and trying to understand large-scale networks and how they basically operate at kind of a macro level in terms of security events, so that you don't waste your time digging through millions and millions and millions of alerts, or just simply throwing them away like most people do, actually. Hey there. Come on, actually he's up here. I don't mean to embarrass you. Froggy's awesome, by the way. I want to say a big hearty thank you to Paul and everybody involved at Notacon, because I'm actually seeing some old friends of mine that I haven't seen in a while, which is a lot of fun. So, like Vicky and Larry. So, basically, what this comes down to then is more or less information management. RSS is kind of an offshoot of that. And the reason I choose RSS is because I actually read an assload of RSS, and I find that I had to do something to kind of get beyond it. And this is the technique I came up with, and it's interesting. It's kind of there's a few of us in the world doing it. It's not terribly novel. There's, like I said, a few of us doing it, and it's kind of a takeoff, if you will, of Google News and topics and stuff like that as well. So this is kind of the whole beyond bullets kind of thing that I'm kind of working with here, kind of stories. So what's funny is this sort of resembles like what part of my apartment did during grad school. I love to read lots and lots of information, and I typically try and consume as much as possible. But one of the things that I found is that having stacks of newspapers around or stacks of magazines around isn't just a fire hazard. It's kind of gets in the way of things like that. But basically, it turns out I'm not alone in this kind of this feeling. And Chris, a good friend of mine, dubbed it kind of the infovore. You are information hungry. You simply need to have the stream of information. Now, this information can actually be across multiple disciplines or multiple areas. For example, I read about geopolitical events, geoeconomic events, terrorism, all sorts of things like that. In addition to information security and investing and all these other things, and just for fun and photo blogs from around the world, places I've either been or people I know or people that I'd like to meet and stuff like that. So basically I have this huge amount of information that I'd like to consume, kind of constructing, if you will, kind of this continuous evolving world picture. And I know that I'm not alone in that. There's lots of people, I think, who like to read a lot of different things. And secondly, I think with a lot of the things that have gone on here in the States in the past few years, we are more aware, I think, more aware than ever of kind of the nature of the news media business, which is to say sort of self-censoring, sort of spinning its own thing, as well as being influenced by outside spin masters. For example, I think we've all heard about how the current administration has paid thousands and thousands of dollars to various people to kind of pretend to be sort of objective or pundits, if you will, inside of an industry or inside of a market. And it's kind of disturbing. And one of the ways that you can use to detect this is to actually consume lots of different sources of information. You can detect, for example, spin, you can detect bias, you can detect kind of incomplete stories, and kind of point up with a fuller, richer picture for yourself. And so you get this by basically digesting assloads of information on a continuous basis. And you can't simply do this kind of like once a week. You have to do this more or less on an ongoing basis to kind of figure out what's going on in this world. And like I said, I know that I'm not alone in that. And so, for example, when I walk by a stack of, a row rather, of newspaper machines, I generally want to buy them all and kind of read them all. But you can't do that because you kind of wind up with this information overload, and you wind up more or less carrying around just piles and piles of paper every day. And where do you put it? Forests and stuff like that, simply getting burned down just for your information consumption, stuff like that. And it's not even terribly, it's not terribly comprehensive, right? There's like 10 or 12 here, and I'm reading something like 50 newspapers a day. I'm not reading them entirely, right? But I'm basically picking stories out of them and kind of reading things that are interesting to me out of like 50 different newspapers. That's even longer than this. It would cost me a small fortune every day just to keep up with it, in addition to massive amounts of time requirements that it would actually require. But this is kind of more or less what you can do with RSS. You can actually run around, you can download stories from newspapers all over the world and actually kind of keep abreast of news stories this way. For those of you that aren't familiar with RSS, I guess I should have mentioned this earlier. RSS is simply really simple syndication, or the RDF site summary. And it's an XML format that uses kind of a common set of tags and namespaces to describe volatile content or dynamic content. So you have a title for a story, you have a link to the story, you have maybe a blurb or even the whole story itself, you have other information about the story, like the author and the time it was posted and things like that. And this works great for blogs, this works great for newspapers, this works great for TV schedules and weather reports, etc. All these kind of things that can be serialized out as a stream of items, a stream of events and descriptions kind of work really well in this tag. So that's basically it, right? It's basically serializing a very dynamic site and getting the items from those sites and those pages delivered to you in kind of an automated fashion. So the RSS Reader application is actually a poll-driven application. And this is kind of the generic format of what the actual UI looks like. So on the left, you have this, in green, you have kind of the list of feeds over here. And this kind of how I'm going to segue, if you will, into kind of the shortcomings of such a model at this point. So over here on the left, you have feeds. So these are sometimes grouped into folders. But you might have, for example, a news folder, which contains the newspapers that you like to read. You might have a list of your friends' blogs. You might have photo blogs, for example, that you like to keep track of. And other news sources kind of grouped maybe by topic or maybe by source or something like that. And then on top, you have the individual stories, and then the bottom, you have an individual entry from that feed and from those stories. You can actually read then the text, and this is kind of how you surf through it. Looks a lot like Outlook in the sense that you have folders, you have messages within, and then you have a message itself. And this is basically the workflow within that. So you select a feed, you have items in that feed, and then you go on and you read an entry. Now, the RSS application does a lot of the heavy lifting for you, right? So instead of having to run around every morning or every hour even and check all these different sites, what changed, what's new, what's interesting, which simply doesn't scale after like a dozen sites for most people. You spend all your time basically hitting reload in your web browser. Listen basically does that. Like every hour, every few hours, it runs around, it pulls down the new RSS feed, basically finds the new items, things that are new to its local database, and actually presents them to you as new. And then you can quickly scale through them. Obviously, you can look at per feed, you can say, okay, which feeds I'm interested in right now, which ones have new entries. Within the entries, you can look at the titles, you can say, okay, which ones kind of sound interesting, and then you can quickly skim the items. And of course, jump then to the web page for kind of a fuller picture. But ultimately, this is also the downfall of this application as well when you start thinking beyond maybe 1 or 2 dozen feeds. So this is, for example, a screenshot of one of the RSS readers that I use. It's called Sharp Reader. For those of you that don't know, I actually run Windows XP. I used to run OpenBSD, but not anymore. But basically, on the left-hand side, you can see a list of feeds, and some that are highlighted and some that aren't, or bold rather, and some that aren't bold, showing you which ones are new. On the top here, then, we have a list of stories, sorted by date in this case, and then an individual story here. But what's immediately obvious is that if you look actually at the scroll bar here, it starts way over here, right? So I have a pile of feeds in here. And simply going through this and maintaining this for myself and keeping abreast of this problem, and for people kind of in this position, is simply an untenable position to be in. You basically waste hours and hours and hours a day trying to basically keep up on this flood of information coming in. Now, there's a couple of things that really suck about this. Obviously, all you have is an indicator of something that's either new, because it's in bold, or in unread, or something that you've already read, which is kind of normal face type. But basically, you have no other indicators here. And you can't, for example, mark a feed as being something that if a new item comes in, you have to know immediately. So for example, it could be, if you're interested in investing, it could be, say, stock market quotes. If you're interested in a topic of news, it could actually be, for example, breaking news on a topic. You have no mechanism within a typical RSS reader to kind of highlight and pop that for you as kind of a high priority event for you. It's a very flat space in that respect. And secondly, here's this application basically watching what you do and things that you like to look at. And it has no semblance at all, no knowledge, if you will, of overlap and duplication within these feeds, because if you're reading a lot of different newspapers, you're going to see the same topics over and over again. But it also can't find the interesting things within there for you, either based upon what the community is talking about as kind of a buzz, or things that you like to read kind of based upon your personal history. And so this is really the driving force of why I do what I do, kind of the shortcomings of a typical RSS reader. And so I'm going to try and use the characteristics of the flood that kind of make it unmanageable and kind of unwieldy to try and manage the flood itself, right? So the big annoying thing is if you read the New York Times, the AP, BBC, Guardian, UPI, et cetera, you're basically reading about the same story maybe a dozen times in any hour. And this gets really annoying, but also kind of untenable. It doesn't really help you kind of figure out the interesting bits of this. You skim over them, but in fact, basically you're missing interesting points within them because each of these has a different perspective on it. But it'd be great to be able to use this duplication to kind of highlight, everyone's talking about this. Maybe this is interesting. And so here we have, for example, a number of stories that are interesting. Within a set of 3 feeds in this case, we have these individual bars here are the actual stories that are interesting. So we have unread stories or sort of interesting things here in red, and things that are not so interesting in black. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to take this into the next step, and we're going to find ones that are related. We're going to group them together here, and we're going to make a cluster of them. So what we've done immediately is we've taken 3 stories have made 1 cluster, 1 story out of it. Again, very, very useful, but it's also highlighted for you the interesting things out of those feeds. And that's ultimately the wall that we're going to do here with this. We're going to keep repeating this process over and over and over again. I'll explain sort of how it works, but that's really the gist of it right there.